Thursday morning, Columbus, Ohio suburb. Carol's hand is already on the coffee mug when her hip catches, not pain, something stranger than pain, a slight sideways drift like a gear that didn't quite engage. She sets the mug down, stands still, tries it again. Same thing, a small mechanical wrongness where there used to be nothing but movement. She's 52. She runs. She takes her calcium. She is not, by any reasonable measure, someone who should be standing in her kitchen at 6 in the morning wondering why her own body feels like it's answering from a distance. She pours the coffee. She moves on. But the feeling doesn't leave with the morning. That moment, that small, private mechanical wrongness, is the beginning of something most people never get to hear explained out loud. What Carol stumbled into, without a single lab result or doctor's visit, is the central fact of bone health after 45. Asterisk the signal comes late, or it doesn't come at all. Asterisk the bones of adults in midlife are not a fixed structure. They are a living system, responsive, dynamic, governed by signals your body is sending and receiving constantly, most of which you will never consciously feel. The trabecular scaffolding inside a femur, the mineral density of a lumbar vertebra, these are in active negotiation with your hormones, your stress load, your sleep architecture, your movement patterns, and forces you've never been told have anything to do with your skeleton. This is where the law of vibration becomes more than a spiritual concept and starts to look like biology. Every system in the body operates at a frequency. Bone tissue responds to mechanical vibration, literally, to the resonance your skeleton generates when you move, when you load it, when you give it the right kind of signal. The body reads frequency. It always has. When the signal is absent, when movement decreases, when the mechanical conversation between muscle and bone goes quiet, the system interprets that silence as permission to remodel downward, to thin, to become less. The law of attraction follows from this. The body builds toward what it is consistently given, not what you intend, what you actually repeatedly signal. Bone density is not a decision. It is an accumulation, and it accumulates, or doesn't, in the dark across years, without asking for your attention. This is where biohacking stops being a fitness trend and starts being genuinely relevant. Because what researchers are now establishing is that the levers available to you, the tools that can change what signal your skeleton is receiving, are not limited to pharmaceuticals or calcium tablets. Targeted mechanical loading, cold exposure, and its downstream effect on bone-forming osteoblast activity. Sleep quality as a direct variable in nocturnal bone regeneration. Specific vibration protocols now used in clinical osteoporosis research. These are not fringe ideas. They are appearing in peer-reviewed literature, and they are almost entirely absent from the conversation most people are having with their doctors. Carol didn't know any of this on Thursday morning. She just knew that something felt different, that the body she'd inhabited for 52 years had offered her a small, uncoded message, and she was standing there trying to read it. That capacity, the body's ability to flag a change before the science has a name for what you're feeling, is not nothing. It is, in fact, the beginning of every useful conversation this video is going to have. Because the map of your skeletal health is more detailed than you've been shown. Parts of it are new. Parts of it are actionable in ways that don't require a prescription or a specialist or a fracture first. What Carol felt was a tension. Her nervous system, quietly, handed her a thread. This next hour is about following it through the research that exists, the mechanisms that are finally being understood, and the practical levers that can actually shift what is happening inside the structure that holds everything else up. The news is not only alarming, that's the part worth staying for. There is a version of this conversation that ends somewhere other than dread. That ends with you understanding your own biology well enough to work with it, deliberately, starting from wherever you currently are. That version begins here. She's standing in her kitchen, early. The kind of early where the light hasn't committed to anything yet, pale gray through the window above the sink, the coffee maker still breathing, that low, wet hiss of water pushing through grounds. She's not rushing. She has nowhere to be for another hour, and she's letting the morning take its time. Her phone is face up on the counter. She picks it up the way most of us do, not because she means to, not because something's urgent, just because it's there and the coffee isn't ready and her hands need something to do. She scrolls. A few headlines, a weather update, something about a flight delay she doesn't care about. And then a post reshared by someone she follows, a longevity physician, the kind of doctor who tends to say things that sit with you longer than they should. She reads it once, then reads it again. The coffee finishes. She doesn't move to pour it. The post was a short excerpt from a piece published by Yahoo creators. The physician wasn't delivering a warning. He wasn't selling anything. He was stating something he described as one of the most undercommunicated facts in modern medicine. Osteoporosis, he wrote, is far more treatable than most people believe. The window for meaningful intervention is real, is wide, and is available to most people currently reading those words. The tragedy, and he used that word, the tragedy is not the disease itself. It is the timing of discovery. Almost no one finds out they have it until they break something. And by then, the most important window has already closed. She sets the phone down on the counter. The ceramic mug is warm in her palm, that specific weight of a full mug, and she stands there for a moment not drinking it. That particular kind of stillness, it's not panic. It's not even worry in the conventional sense. It's something more like the mental equivalent of checking your back pocket and not finding your wallet, that half second before you decide whether it's really gone. The mind running a quiet inventory of what it assumed was fine. Here is what that physician was actually pointing to, because it's worth taking seriously. Osteoporosis affects an estimated 10 million Americans. Another 44 million have low bone density, what clinicians call osteopenia, which is the stage before the diagnosis, the stage where the drift is already happening but nothing has broken yet. Those numbers come from the National Osteoporosis Foundation, and they have not been getting smaller. What makes this particular in the landscape of chronic conditions is the silence of it. Bone loss produces no sensation. There is no pain in the early stages, no warning signal your body reliably sends, no fatigue or visual change that flags a problem. You are walking around on a structure that may be thinning, and you feel nothing different. The morning still looks the same. The coffee still tastes the same. The steps you take across the kitchen floor still sound exactly as they always have. That's the part that should sit somewhere uncomfortable for a moment, not as catastrophizing, but as honest accounting. We are conditioned to trust the body's alarm systems. We trust pain. We trust fatigue. We trust the signals. But bone is one of the places where the body does not alarm early. It accommodates. It compensates. It quietly redistributes load until it can't, and then something breaks, and only then does the system announce itself. A hip fracture in a woman over 65 carries a 1-year mortality rate of somewhere between 15 and 30%, depending on the study. That number has appeared in the literature long enough that it stopped shocking the people who cite it. But it should still shock the rest of us. A broken bone from a fall, from stepping off a curb wrong, from reaching for something on a shelf, becomes a life-altering event with a mortality profile that rivals certain cancers. And almost all of it is preceded by years, sometimes decades, of detectable, measurable, addressable bone loss. The physician's point, the one she read twice before the coffee had a chance to cool, wasn't alarmist. That's what made it stick. He was saying something precise. The disease has a long prequel, and that prequel is where all the leverage lies. Bone is not static. This is the first thing that surprises most people when they actually look at it. We think of the skeleton as fixed architecture, the thing that stays while everything else changes, organs cycling, cells replacing, chemistry shifting. But bone is metabolically active, constantly being broken down and rebuilt. The balance between those two processes is what determines density. In your 20s, the rebuilding side tends to win. Peak bone mass in most people is reached somewhere in the late 20s to early 30s. After that, the balance begins to shift, gradually, silently, without ceremony. The factors that accelerate that shift are not obscure. Some are hormonal, some are nutritional, some are mechanical, meaning related to load-bearing activity, the literal weight and stress you put on bone, which is one of the primary signals the body uses to decide how much bone to maintain. And increasingly, research points toward chronic stress physiology as a meaningful contributor. Not stress in the abstract, in the specific biochemical sense. Sustained activation of the body's threat detection system quietly tips the cellular balance toward breakdown. A 2020 study in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research looked at data from over 11,000 postmenopausal women and found significant associations between elevated psychological distress and reduced bone mineral density, independent of the usual confounders. The mechanism runs through glucocorticoid signaling, the same hormonal cascade activated under sustained stress, and its downstream effect on the cells responsible for rebuilding bone. Under prolonged stress chemistry, those cells work less efficiently. The architecture quietly loses ground. This is where two ideas that sound like philosophy turn out to be physiology. The law of vibration holds that everything, including the body, exists in a state of constant frequency, and that frequency is shaped by the dominant emotional and mental states you sustain over time. The law of attraction, properly understood, is not about wishful thinking. It is about the observable fact that what you hold in sustained focus and feeling tends to draw corresponding conditions, internally as much as externally. Put those principles next to the glucocorticoid data and they stop being abstract. Chronic low-frequency states, sustained dread, helplessness, the background hum of unresolved threat are not just psychological weather. They are biological inputs. They alter the chemistry of rebuilding. The woman standing in that kitchen, holding a warm mug, feeling the difference between dread and clarity, that difference is not metaphorical. It is registered at the cellular level, which means the inverse is also true. Shifting into an emotional frequency of agency, of genuine forward orientation, is not optimism as decoration. It is a physiological intervention, not the only one, but a real one with a measurable mechanism beneath it. What she understood, or began to, was something that isn't obvious from the outside looking in. The information didn't frighten her the way health information often does. It clarified something. There's a difference, and it's worth naming. Fear, as a response to health news, tends to be paralyzing. It produces avoidance, not action. The research on medical anxiety, specifically health threat avoidance, studied at length by researchers at the University of Amsterdam and published in Clinical Psychological Science, consistently shows that when people receive information framed primarily as danger, they are more likely to avoid screening, avoid follow-through, avoid the very interventions that could help them. The alarm activates the aversion, but information framed as a window, as a period in which something meaningful is possible, produces a different response. Not optimism in the shallow sense, but engagement. The body registers these differently. The difference between dread and agency, physiologically, runs through distinct neural pathways. Dread activates avoidance circuitry. The perception of agency, even partial, even contingent, activates approach circuitry. And the approach state is the one in which you make the appointment, ask the question, get the scan. This is what the physician understood and what informed how he wrote. He didn't say you might be dying quietly. He said the window is open, and most people simply don't know it's there. Which raises a question worth planting right here before this moves forward. If the window is that wide, if the evidence is that clear, if the tools for detection are available, if the treatment trajectory is genuinely more favorable than the public understands, then why does almost everyone find out they have osteoporosis only after something breaks? That is not a rhetorical question. There's a specific answer, and it has less to do with medicine than it does with the architecture of how information travels, or fails to, between what doctors know and what patients are ever asked about. She's still standing in the kitchen. The smell of the coffee has shifted, the way it does when it's been sitting, from sharp to something warmer and flatter. The gray in the window has gone to white. The mug in her hand has gone from warm to cool, and she hasn't noticed because she's already opened her calendar. That moment, the phone moving from scroll to schedule, from passive reception to directed action, is the whole story of what the window actually means. It doesn't stay open on its own, but it is open, and recognizing it is already something. Recognizing it, and letting that recognition move through you at the frequency of possibility rather than threat, is not a small thing. It is, in the most literal sense available, the beginning of a different outcome. 1 in 2, not 1 in 10, not 1 in 20. 1 in every 2 women who crosses the threshold of 50 years old will fracture something, a hip, a wrist, a vertebra, because of bone density she didn't know she was losing. Sit with that for a second. If you walked into any coffee shop this morning and asked the women sitting there whether they knew that number, the honest answer, drawn from actual survey data, is that most of them would not. And I want to be clear, that's not negligence. That's not carelessness. That's something more structural than that. Something built into how this disease moves, or rather, how it doesn't move, how it doesn't announce itself at all. And that's where the question from earlier in this video finally lands its answer. If osteoporosis is treatable, why does it keep being discovered too late? The answer is almost insultingly simple once you see it. Osteoporosis doesn't give you anything to notice. Think about the conditions that actually change behavior in people over 45. High blood pressure, high cholesterol, early cardiovascular symptoms. Even weight gain, you feel it in your clothes, you see it when you move. These conditions have informants. They send signals. Your body creates friction in your daily experience, and that friction eventually sends you somewhere, to a doctor, to a conversation, to a decision. Osteoporosis has no informants. You wake up the same way you woke up 10 years ago. You move through your day the same way. Your reflection gives you nothing. There's no ache, no flicker, no whisper from the skeleton. What's actually happening inside the bone, the quiet, incremental thinning of that internal lattice work, those internal walls growing more porous, the spaces between them widening, none of it registers as sensation. The body carries on. You carry on. There is no alarm. I want you to imagine something. Think about the walls of an old house. The paint is smooth. The surface looks fine. You can press your palm flat against it and feel nothing wrong. But behind the plaster, something structural has been retreating for years, quietly in the dark, without asking permission. That is what bone loss looks like from the inside of a life. You don't feel the plaster thinning. You only find out when the wall finally gives. There is a particular quality to a late autumn afternoon, the light going gray and flat by 4 o'clock, a faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere you can't quite identify, that specific chill that settles into the shoulders and stays there. That makes a number like 1 in 2 land somewhere deeper than the surface. Because in that light, the number stops being a statistic and becomes something more specific. It becomes the woman next door. It becomes your mother. It becomes you. Here's what that number actually means in physical terms. A woman at 50 who doesn't know her bone density, and that describes the majority of women at 50, because fewer than 30% have ever had a bone density scan, is already at the midpoint of a process that began in her mid-30s. Not triggered by menopause, though menopause dramatically accelerates it. A process that was already in motion, already moving without permission, before she turned 40. When estrogen drops at menopause, it releases a kind of brake on the cells that dissolve old bone tissue. The rate of bone loss in the 5 to 7 years following menopause is faster than at any other point in adult life. We're talking about the potential loss of up to 20% of bone density in that window alone. 20% in 7 years, in complete silence. Here's something I want you to understand about yourself, about all of us, really, because this part matters. The human attention system is genuinely excellent at responding to what is visible, what is painful, what changes the texture of getting through a day. It is poorly designed for threats that carry no sensory signature whatsoever. The brain doesn't generate urgency for a problem it cannot perceive. That's not a character flaw. That's the architecture of the perceptual system, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years in an environment where invisible, slow-moving structural damage inside the skeleton was not the primary thing likely to kill you. So when a woman at 53 is thinking seriously about her health, and she is thinking about it probably with real effort, her attention goes where sensation and social narrative direct it. The number on the scale, the cholesterol panel, the blood pressure reading. These are the things producing friction. These are the health stories she's been handed by every cultural institution around her. Bone density is not that story. A woman can be doing every right thing she's been told to do, managing her weight, monitoring her heart, getting her annual blood work, and still be moving quietly toward a fracture. Not because she was careless, because no one handed her the instrument that would have told her to look in that direction. The fracture, when it comes, is the first symptom. Read that again, because it should feel as strange to hear as it is to say out loud. The first symptom of a disease that has been advancing for 15 years is a broken bone. A fall that at 25 would have produced a bruise and mild embarrassment produces, at 62, a fracture. Or a woman bends forward to lift groceries, and a vertebra collapses inward, sudden, severe pain, and she arrives in an emergency room where the osteoporosis is discovered not as a warning, but as an explanation. And sometimes it's the hip. Hip fractures in people over 65 carry a 1-year mortality rate that stops most people cold when they first hear it. Between 20 and 30% of people who fracture a hip after 65 will be dead within 12 months, not from the fracture itself, but from the cascade that follows: immobility, pneumonia, blood clots, the systemic shock of prolonged hospitalization on a body that had already been quietly compromised. The disease is treated as invisible because it behaves as invisible, and the cost of that invisibility is paid all at once, in a single moment, in the form of a fall that was never supposed to be serious. Now, I don't want you sitting with this information and feeling afraid. And I mean that specifically, not as reassurance, but as something that's actually important to understand about the body you're living in. There is real, documented research on what chronic psychological stress does to bone. Fear, sustained, low-grade, unresolved fear, activates hormonal cascades involving glucocorticoids, and those cascades measurably interfere with the body's ability to maintain and rebuild bone tissue. The relationship between prolonged stress and accelerated bone loss is not a metaphor. Studies looking at bereavement, caregiver burden, post-traumatic stress, they all point in the same direction. Fear about bone loss can, through mechanisms that are neither vague nor philosophical, contribute to the very condition being feared. This is where the laws of vibration and attraction stop being abstract concepts and start being physiological ones. The inner state you're operating from is not decorative. It is not a mood. It is biological signal. A body held in chronic low-frequency stress, anxious, braced, waiting for the next thing to go wrong, is not a body that prioritizes building. And the biohacking framework that actually works here is not a supplement stack or a protocol. It begins with a reorientation of the signal you're sending. So what this chapter is asking for, what your body can actually work with, is something cooler and more useful than fear. Attention. Directed, calm, investigative attention. The kind that belongs to someone who's just been told that something significant has been happening without their knowledge, and who has decided that knowing is better than not knowing, regardless of what the knowing reveals. That decision alone shifts something, not metaphorically. In the actual hormonal and nervous system environment your bones are living in. A bone density scan, the standard diagnostic tool, takes 10 to 30 minutes. The radiation exposure is roughly equivalent to an hour of sitting outside on a clear day. It produces a single number that tells you with considerable precision where your bone density sits relative to peak bone mass. That information is available. That test is available. And for millions of women, it simply hasn't happened, not because of negligence, but because a silent disease in a crowded 20-minute appointment loses to the symptoms that showed up that morning. But here's what I want you to leave this chapter with, and I want you to feel the difference between this and dread. You are not passive in this. The skeleton is the frame on which everything else hangs, not decorative, structural, and it is responsive to what you do, what you track, what you decide deserves your attention. The body keeps its own ledger, yes. It doesn't wait for you to be ready, yes. But it also responds. That is the fact that changes everything. The same system that loses bone in the presence of chronic stress and inattention is the system that rebuilds in the presence of the right inputs: mechanical, nutritional, hormonal, and yes, psychological. The T-score doesn't negotiate, but the trajectory does. That's not a soft claim. That's the actual science. And it means that the most empowering move available to you right now, today, in this light, in this body, at this age, is simply to know where you stand. Everything useful begins from there. You were 35 when this started, not 45. Not the year your hormones shifted or the year your doctor started using the word post. 35. You were probably doing something entirely different with your attention, building something, raising something, surviving something. You were not thinking about bone remodeling. Nobody is. That's the architecture of the whole problem, not ignorance, not negligence. Timing. The body moves silently when the mind is occupied somewhere else. Here is when it begins, 35. Let's talk about what's actually happening inside the tissue. Every bone in your body is alive. This is not a figure of speech. It is biology operating at a cellular level continuously, without pause, without your permission or awareness. Two types of cells run the operation. Osteoblasts, the builders. They synthesize new bone matrix, lay down fresh collagen, mineralize the tissue. Osteoclasts, the dismantlers. They break down old, worn bone, dissolving it, resorbing it, clearing the way for what should come next. These two cells have been in conversation since you were forming in utero. The conversation under healthy conditions is balanced. Build and dismantle at roughly equal rates. The architecture stays solid. The balance begins to shift at 35. Research published in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research, not a single study, but a pattern replicated across decades of data, shows that peak bone mass is reached somewhere in the late 20s to early 30s. After that, the balance tips. Osteoclast activity begins to outpace osteoblast activity, slightly at first, almost imperceptibly, 1% per year, give or take. A number so small it sounds like nothing until you multiply it by 10, by 15, by 20, and then estrogen or testosterone decline enters the picture. The sex hormones, estrogen primarily, but testosterone as well, are not peripheral to this conversation. They are central to it. Estrogen, specifically, acts as a regulator of bone remodeling. It suppresses osteoclast activity. It keeps the dismantlers from working too fast. When estrogen levels begin to drop, not all at once, but in the gradual, unannounced way that hormone shifts actually occur, the suppression lifts. The osteoclasts accelerate. The builders cannot keep pace. The Endocrine Society's clinical guidelines document the math with uncomfortable precision. In the first 5 to 7 years following menopause, women can lose between 10 and 20% of their bone density. Not over a lifetime. In a window of years. Men experience the same mechanism through declining testosterone, operating on a slower timeline but arriving at the same destination. But here is where the timeline becomes personal rather than statistical. The process that accelerates after hormonal decline was already in motion. The groundwork was being laid throughout your 30s, quietly, in the ordinary weeks and years when you were doing what life required. A conference call you took standing in a parking lot in November, the asphalt damp under your shoes, a weekend spent driving your kids somewhere, the car smelling of fast food and wet jackets. A stretch of months where sleep was what you got between the things that demanded you. All of that time, osteoblasts and osteoclasts were negotiating, and the negotiation was already shifting. Think about the moment you learn this, sitting somewhere ordinary, maybe a clinic waiting room, maybe your kitchen, a printout in your hand, or a screen you've been staring at long enough that the words stopped resolving cleanly. The number on the bone density report, the T-score, the phrase, below expected range for age. There is a specific quality to that moment, not dramatic, closer to the feeling of finally understanding the punchline to a joke you've been hearing for years. Something was happening and you didn't know, and now you do, and the knowing sits heavy before anything else can come near it. That matters, not as absolution, but as accurate diagnosis. Because the tendency, when we learn that something began earlier than we realized, is to layer guilt on top of the biology. To treat the fact of the earlier start as evidence of some failure in attention or discipline. The research does not support that interpretation. The decline in bone formation relative to resorption in the post-peak years is a normative biological process. It is not the result of lifestyle failure alone. It is a feature of the aging endocrine system, present regardless of how carefully you ate or how consistently you exercised. What lifestyle factors do is modify the rate, not eliminate the process. This is where the conversation becomes more precise and less comfortable, because among the modifiable factors, calcium intake, vitamin D, weight-bearing activity, alcohol consumption, smoking status, there is one that appears in the bone research in a way that most clinicians underdiscuss: chronic physiological stress, not the kind that comes and goes, the kind that settles into the body's baseline and stays there. The mechanism is specific. When the body runs sustained stress hormones, glucocorticoids, cortisol among them, those hormones have a direct inhibitory effect on osteoblast activity. The builders slow down. This isn't speculation. It's what the tissue actually does, and it's been observed consistently enough that the National Osteoporosis Foundation addresses it directly in its synthesis literature. The stress physiology that became normalized in the decades between 35 and 55 does not stay contained to the nervous system. It moves into the tissue. It participates in the remodeling imbalance, which means the years of sustained pressure, the professional pressure, the financial pressure, the relationship pressure, the particular exhaustion of being someone other people needed. Those years were not neutral with respect to bone. They were participants. That's not a small thing to sit with, and most people don't get enough time to sit with it before they are handed a supplement recommendation and sent back to their lives. The recognition deserves more than that, because until you understand that the stress itself was biologically active, not just unpleasant, not just tiring, but chemically present in the tissue, the interventions that follow don't fully make sense. You're managing a number without understanding the machine that produced it. Now here is what the research has started to circle. The biology is real. The timeline is documented. The hormonal mechanism is not in dispute. But researchers looking at populations with nearly identical biological profiles, same age, same hormonal status, same calcium intake, similar exercise history. Keep finding a gap they can't fully close with the standard variables. Some people lose bone faster. Some maintain density longer. The numbers don't entirely explain each other. And when researchers attempt to identify what distinguishes them, they start looking at something that goes beyond what a standard panel measures: the sustained internal state of the person. Not just the body's chemistry as captured at a single blood draw, but the quality of the nervous system's daily operating conditions. What the body is running at hour to hour over years. There is a growing body of work, still developing, that treats this not as a soft variable but as a physiological one. The idea that chronic internal state, the baseline from which a person meets their life, participates in biological rate in ways that cortisol measurements alone don't capture. That the difference between two people with matching labs and diverging outcomes might live somewhere in that territory. This is where this is heading. And before the next layer of it opens, it's worth sitting for a moment with everything that's already been said. The 35, the osteoclasts, the cortisol, the parking lot in November, the recognition that the stress wasn't neutral. Let it be more than information, because what comes next asks something of you beyond understanding it. It asks you to consider whether the internal state you've been running is one you chose, one you inherited, or one you can actually change, and what the biological stakes of that question genuinely are. The question came back now, didn't it? The one planted several chapters ago, quiet and persistent. Whether the emotional state of resistance, the vigilance, the bracing, has a real and measurable effect on bone tissue. Not a vague, wellness-adjacent suggestion. A measurable one. The kind that shows up in a biopsy, in a bone density scan, in the cellular record your body keeps whether you're paying attention or not. The answer is heavier than you might expect. There is a sound that older houses make in winter. Not the dramatic crack of a pipe, something subtler. A low, persistent settling, joists adjusting. Wood contracting against cold it has been absorbing for weeks without anyone noticing. The house looks fine from the street. The lights are on. Dinner is being made. But underneath the floors, something structural is quietly shifting under pressure that never fully let up. Your skeleton has been doing the same thing, not because you ignored it, not because you failed to take the calcium, or skipped the weight-bearing exercise, or didn't read the right article. Something else has been applying pressure, something that looks nothing like a fall, nothing like a fracture, nothing like any image you have ever associated with bone loss. It looks instead like a posture, an internal posture. The constant, low-grade readiness that a body adopts when it has decided, somewhere below conscious thought, that the situation is not yet safe enough to stand down. Call it what you want: vigilance, bracing, resistance to the direction things are going. That tight, familiar alertness that settles in somewhere between the shoulder blades and the jaw, the one that doesn't have a name but has been present off and on for years. Sometimes triggered by the news, sometimes by a number on a lab report, sometimes by nothing specific at all, just the ambient sense that the ground is less reliable than it used to be. That posture has a physiology, and the physiology has a target. Researchers at the University of California, San Francisco spent years tracking what happens to bone at the cellular level in people who carry sustained psychological stress. Not acute stress, not the sprint kind, but the marathon kind. The grinding, long-duration kind that never fully resolves. What they found was not subtle. The architecture of bone maintenance depends on a continuous negotiation between two populations of cells: osteoblasts, which build and repair bone tissue, and osteoclasts, which break it down. In a healthy, low-threat environment, that negotiation stays roughly in balance. The body maintains its structure because maintaining structure is part of what the body is for. Here is where it gets personal, though the research doesn't use that word. When the threat state is sustained, when the system never fully receives the signal that the emergency has passed, the negotiation tips. The UX findings, corroborated by work published in the Journal of Psychosomatic Research, showed that prolonged elevation of glucocorticoids, the hormonal family deployed during sustained stress activation, directly suppresses osteoblastic activity. The builders slow down. The breakers continue. The ratio shifts in a direction that no supplement alone corrects, because the supplement is not addressing the reason the ratio shifted in the first place. The logic is not mysterious. The body, in a genuine emergency, makes a brutal calculation. Invest resources in immediate survival, not in long-term maintenance. Bone is expensive to maintain: energy, mineral cycling, constant cellular repair. When the system is on alert, the body deprioritizes that investment. Not forever in theory, just until the threat passes. The problem is that for a person over 45, the threat often doesn't pass. It changes shape. It moves from one news cycle to the next. It lives in the background hum of financial uncertainty, of watching parents decline, of feeling the body shift in ways that don't respond to the same interventions they used to. The alert state was designed for a sprint. Instead, it has been running a marathon, and the bones have been paying the tab. There is a moment in the UX data worth sitting with. The researchers noted that individuals with the highest markers of sustained stress activation showed bone density loss patterns that outpaced what would be predicted by age alone. And the discrepancy wasn't explained by diet, exercise, sleep, or any of the standard variables. The variable that tracked closest to accelerated bone loss was the internal state, the degree to which the nervous system had been held in a posture of sustained readiness, sustained bracing, sustained resistance to the possibility of ease. That's a measurement, not a metaphor, a number in a data set. What the UX work adds to the cumulative story of your bones is this: it is not only the story of what you ate and how you moved. It is also the story of how long your body believed it was in danger. The body does not distinguish between a predator and a policy crisis. It does not distinguish between physical threat and the psychological weight of watching the world become a place that requires constant monitoring. It reads the internal environment, the hormonal weather, and responds accordingly. Glucocorticoids elevated long enough, and osteoblasts slow their work, not because the body is failing, because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do: prioritize immediate survival over structural maintenance. Keep the organism moving in the short term. Worry about the architecture later. Later, for many people over 45, never fully arrives. This is the part that tends to land quietly, then harder. The vigilance itself, the careful watching, the health monitoring, the reading of studies and tracking of symptoms and anxious attention to every new number can, if it carries a sustained undercurrent of threat, be part of the problem it is trying to solve. Not always, not inevitably, But when the monitoring comes wrapped in resistance, in the emotional posture of someone bracing against what the body might do next, it sustains exactly the hormonal environment that accelerates the process being monitored. The Journal of Psychosomatic Research was precise about this. It wasn't the awareness that was harmful. Awareness is neutral, even useful. It was the sustained emotional charge around that awareness, the alertness that never fully resolved, the vigilance that couldn't find a landing place, that drove the glucocorticoid elevation. The body reads the signal, not the intention. A man sitting at a kitchen table in January, socks on cold wood, genuinely trying to take care of himself. If the act of trying is wrapped in dread, the bones are receiving a different message than he thinks he's sending. The structural damage isn't announced. It accumulates in the gap between the life the body was designed to live, with genuine periods of safety, genuine downregulation, genuine rest from threat, and the life many people over 45 are actually living, which involves a low, continuous current of vigilance that feels normal because it has been present for so long. Normal and harmless are not the same thing. This is where two tools enter the picture, not as philosophy, but as practical mechanism. The law of vibration holds that every cell, every tissue, every sustained emotional state operates at a measurable frequency, and that the body's internal environment is continuously shaped by the dominant signal it is running. The law of attraction, properly understood, is not about optimism. It is about resonance. What the system holds as its ongoing signal is what the system organizes around, biologically. Osteoblasts are not indifferent to the hormonal whether they operate inside. They are reading it continuously and adjusting their work accordingly, which means the conversation about bone density is also a conversation about signal. Not the signal you intend to send, the one the body is actually receiving. If the internal environment is chronically organized around threat, around resistance, bracing, the posture of a person who has been waiting for the situation to become safe enough to finally stand down, the body will keep making the same calculation it has been making. Maintenance can wait. The builders will stand down. The calcium tablet still matters. The weight-bearing exercise still matters. But they are operating inside a hormonal environment, and that environment is set by something upstream of any protocol. The frequency the system is running. The signal underneath everything else. That is not an abstraction. It is the mechanism the UXF data was pointing at the whole time, without using those words. The researchers measured the result. What these two laws describe is the sequence, how a sustained internal state becomes a biological instruction, and how changing that state changes what the body is told to build. That is where the actual leverage is. And it is accessible. Not through adding another item to an already exhausted list, but through recognizing what signal the system has been running and understanding with some precision now how to change it. There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a person around this age, and I want to be specific about what I mean, because this is not the silence of a quiet room or a morning without traffic. This is the silence of something happening inside you that produces no signal you can read. You don't wake up with pain. You don't limp. You don't see it in the mirror the way you'd see a bruise or a cut. The skeleton that has held you upright through every decade of your life, through every crisis, every season, it simply continues. And in that continuance, something slower is occurring. A gradual change in density, in places you will never directly observe. That is what the earlier part of this conversation began circling, the mechanism by which chronic stress instructs the body to sacrifice structural tissue in the name of immediate survival. Here is how that works, plainly. When the body reads its environment as persistently threatening, not a single emergency, but a low, unrelenting state of alert, it routes resources toward functions that matter right now. Glucose stays available for muscles that might need to move fast. Inflammatory pathways stay open for wounds that might arrive. And the slower, more expensive work of laying down new bone mineral, the constant remodeling cycle your skeleton depends on, gets deprioritized. Not stopped, deprioritized, day after day. The osteoblasts, the cells that build new bone matrix, become less active. The osteoclasts, which break old bone down, continue on schedule, over months, over years. The balance tips. The architecture quietly changes. You hear the sound of coffee being poured in another room, the ceramic clink of a mug on a countertop. Ordinary, unremarkable, and somewhere in a body that has heard that sound 10,000 mornings, a skeleton is doing math it never announces. Now, here is the part that almost never makes it into the conversation about bone health, and I want to be careful to report this accurately because it matters. In 2019, researchers at the Stanford Center on Longevity published findings from a multi-year study examining how adults over 45 perceive and respond to what the team called invisible bodily vulnerability. The sense that something structural, something load-bearing, might be quietly changing without any perceptible signal. What they found was not what the bone density conversation typically includes. They found that this class of concern, formless, objectless, carried without a name, produced a measurable shift in baseline emotional state. Not depression, not clinical anxiety, something the research team specifically labeled anticipatory somatic dread. Anticipatory, meaning it lives in the future, not in a present symptom. Somatic, meaning it registers in the body before the mind has finished forming the thought. Dread, not fear. Fear has an object. Dread is diffuse, persistent, and it wears the same face as a bad day, a flat morning, a vague reluctance to make plans. This is what nobody names. Not the doctor, who is focused on your density scores and your calcium intake and your exercise log. Not the health podcasts, which are interested in output and measurable improvement. And not the wellness industry, which would rather sell you control than acknowledge the vertigo of not knowing what's happening inside a structure you've trusted your entire life. What this research describes, and I want you to feel this as recognition, not new information, is that a significant portion of adults over 45 are carrying a form of anxiety that has no name in the common vocabulary. They've been calling it stress or age or just the way things are now, but the actual texture of it is more precise. It is the disorientation of aging in parts that are invisible. The gray hair you can see, the changing skin you can see. You can develop a relationship with those things, a begrudging peace, or a genuine acceptance, depending on the day. But the trabecular scaffolding inside your femur, the mineral density inside the vertebrae stacked between your shoulder blades, those operate in a register your senses do not access. And the mind, which evolved to monitor threats it can see and measure and respond to, does not do well with threats it can only suspect. The Stanford study found that participants who scored highest on invisible vulnerability awareness also showed elevated markers of what the researchers called baseline emotional depletion. Not clinical, not dramatic, just a persistent low-level drain that made everything slightly harder. Decisions felt heavier. Mornings took longer to come into focus. The future, instead of feeling open, felt subtly foreclosed, not by any specific fear, but by the ambient weight of not knowing. And here is where the story tightens, and why this matters beyond biology. That emotional depletion is not just a consequence of silent structural change. It feeds it. The same physiological cascade that shifts resources away from bone maintenance also runs on emotional state, on the felt sense of safety or its absence. The body does not distinguish between "I am worried about geopolitical instability" and "I am worried about my bones," and "I am worried about whether something load-bearing in me is quietly failing." It receives it all as the same signal. The world is not safe. Brace. And so a person who has never been diagnosed with anything, who has never had a scan, never been told there is a problem, may still be living inside a chronic state that is, physiologically speaking, instructing the skeleton to do less of the building work it needs to do to stay strong. When I lay it out this way, I want you to feel something shift. Not pleasant, exactly, but useful. Because this is where the law of vibration and the law of attraction stop being abstract and start being physiological. The law of vibration says that everything in the body, every cell, every tissue, every system is operating at a frequency. Not metaphor. Measurable electrical and biochemical activity. The chronic low-frequency state of unresolved dread is not neutral background noise. It is an active signal. The body is reading it and responding accordingly, allocating resources as though the threat is real, ongoing, and requires permanent vigilance. The architecture pays that cost quietly. The law of attraction, understood not as wishful thinking, but as the documented tendency of internal state to shape physiological output, tells us the inverse of that cost is equally real. The Stanford qualitative data pointed directly at this. The participants with the lowest levels of anticipatory somatic dread were not the ones with the best density scores. They were not on the most rigorous protocols. They were the ones who had, in their own words, made some kind of peace with not being able to see everything happening inside them. A trust, not in the body as a perfect machine, but in the body as a system fundamentally oriented toward its own continuation. That shift in internal frequency, from bracing against an invisible threat to something quieter, something more like informed trust, is not philosophical comfort. It changes the signal the body is running on. And when the signal changes, the allocation changes. The osteoblasts are not waiting for a perfect scan result before deciding how much work to do. They are responding to the environment the nervous system is reporting right now. This is the tool, not a supplement, not a protocol. The recognition that your internal state is in active conversation with your skeleton, and that conversation can be changed. Right here, right now, that is where the path forward opens. There is a question that was left open earlier, one about how the body reads its own instructions, about whether the tissue inside you is passive material, waiting on a supplement or a scan to tell it what to do, or whether it is already listening, all the time, to something more immediate than any of that, Most people don't ask the question because the answer asks something back. Here is where this starts, not with a protocol, but with something that happened or that happens to almost every man past 45 if he catches himself at the right angle in the right light. A lobby, say. The kind with polished floors and glass doors that give you your reflection before you've prepared one. The cold morning air coming in off the street carries a faint smell of floor wax and the last hours of overnight silence. And in the glass, you see yourself walking toward yourself, and something in the picture is wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the wrong of a man in obvious pain. The wrong of a man carrying something he stopped noticing he was carrying. A slow compression, a folding inward. Shoulders drawn forward a degree or two, the chin dropped, the breath sitting high in the chest, not reaching the belly, the foot landing quietly in the way that reduced things are quiet, not peaceful, not settled, but made smaller. You didn't put that posture there consciously. It accumulated, and it has been there in some form for longer than you know. That is not just an aesthetic problem. Research out of Northeastern University on mechanical loading and osteoblast response found something that deserves more attention than it gets. Osteoblasts are the cells responsible for building new bone tissue. And the skeleton, it turns out, is not the static architecture most people imagine when they picture bones dense, inert, waiting to thin or fracture with age. It is a responsive system. It adjusts its own rebuilding activity based on the mechanical signals it receives from how a body moves through space. Compression, tension, the direction and quality of load. The bone reads these the way a living thing reads its instructions. Work published in the journal Bone has confirmed that habitual posture and movement patterns create chronic mechanical environments that either stimulate or suppress osteoblastic activity. Not just in athletes training with weight, in ordinary life. The way a man stands at the kitchen counter every morning while the coffee brews. The way he lowers himself into a chair. The way he walks across a parking lot, whether the step is planted or whether it scuffs along the pavement, apologetic. So go back to the lobby. Think of two versions of the same man crossing the same floor on the same cold morning. In the first version, the shoulders are forward, the chin dropped, the breath shallow. The footfall is quiet in a diminished way. The body moves as if taking up less space offers some kind of safety. In the second version, the same man, same lobby, same smell of floor wax and early morning, but the spine is long, the sternum is open. The breath drops lower, slower, and the foot meets the floor with something in it, not loudness, but weight, presence. The difference between a body that is occupied and a body that is being managed from a slight distance. Those are not the same mechanical event, and the bone does not treat them as such. A spine held in extension creates a fundamentally different compressive load than a spine folded forward in chronic flexion. One stimulates the mechanoreceptors on osteoblast surfaces. One does not. One sends a signal that reads, "This structure is being used." The other sends a signal that reads, "This structure is being guarded against use." And the skeleton responds the way any living tissue responds to demand, by reinforcing or by withdrawing. That is physiology, plain and unglamorous. But underneath the physiology is something harder to measure and more important. Because the posture isn't only producing a mechanical output. The posture is reporting an internal state. And the internal state, the particular quality of how a man inhabits his body across the unremarkable hours of an ordinary day, is not separate from the mechanical environment he creates inside his own skeleton, hour after hour. The man with the collapsed chest and the shallow breath is not choosing that posture. He is embodying something, a relationship to his body, a low-grade belief built up over years that the body is fragile or already declining or not quite to be trusted. That belief becomes a posture. The posture becomes a chronic mechanical signal. The signal, held long enough, becomes a slower rate of bone turnover, and the bone does exactly what it was instructed to do, quietly, over months and years, without any fanfare, which is why the fix is not about consciously standing up straight for 20 minutes. You can do that. You can hold the correction for 20 minutes and lose it for the other 23.5 hours, and the bone will have recorded all of it honestly. What matters is the internal state that the posture keeps reporting, what a man actually believes about his body, whether he is in it or above it, whether he trusts it or braces against it. There is a texture to moving with intention that is recognizable once you have felt it. A slight warmth settling into the muscles, a breath that actually reaches the diaphragm. The feeling of occupying the full height you were given without any particular effort to perform that. It is not confidence in the theatrical sense. It is something quieter, an agreement between what you are and how you are moving through the room. That agreement does not just feel different. It registers differently at the cellular level. Habitual compression under extension is a different signal than habitual compression under chronic protective contraction. The bone is not impressed by the shape of the movement. It reads the whole environment, the quality of load, the consistency of it, the way water reads the shape of whatever holds it. The frequency a man carries in his body becomes the mechanical environment he creates in his own skeleton. Every ordinary hour, the step that lands with presence, the shoulder that isn't hauling the jaw forward, the breath that drops low while standing at the window watching the morning arrive through cold glass. These are inputs the bone is integrating continuously into a decision about whether to build or to pull back. Researchers working at the edge of this field are beginning to understand what the longevity industry has not yet found a way to sell. The quality of how a man inhabits his body across unremarkable daily hours is a more powerful biological signal than most single interventions applied to the bone from the outside. The bone does not wait for the appointment. It is taking a reading right now, in whatever chair or hallway or parking lot the body is in at this moment. The question worth sitting with is not complicated, but it is honest. What has yours been finding? There's something that happens when a doctor tells you your bones are losing density. The word osteopenia lands in a room and the air changes. You're sitting there trying to look steady, and what you're actually thinking is, asterisk, how long has this been happening? And did I miss the window, asterisk? Most people walk out of that appointment with a printout about calcium and a referral they may or may not follow up on. And somewhere underneath the logistics of it, the supplements to buy, the follow-up scan in 2 years, there's a quieter thing. A grief, almost. The feeling that the body has started a process you weren't consulted about, and the process only goes one direction. That feeling is worth naming, because the research doesn't start to mean anything until you understand what it's pushing against. And what it's pushing against is that story. The one you absorbed not just from one doctor, but from the whole architecture of how bone health gets communicated to people past 50. that the skeleton is a structure in managed decline, that you slow it, that you try not to fall, that the window for meaningful change largely closed sometime in your 30s, and what you're managing now is the pace of loss, not the possibility of something else. There's a 2023 study in Osteoporosis International that quietly dismantles that story. No drug trial, no surgical intervention. A group of postmenopausal women, average age 58, enrolled in a structured program, specific loading exercises, targeted nutritional adjustments, and after 12 months, their bone mineral density markers moved. Not declined more slowly, not held steady, moved in the direction of formation. The study got a paragraph in a few specialty newsletters. Then the news cycle moved on. But what that finding means is that the window you were wondering about, whether remineralization is something that actually happens in a living body past 50, or whether it stays theoretical, that window is open. And staying with that fact means examining what was wrong with everything that came before it. Start with the nutritional picture, because this is where the damage is least visible and most consequential. Tufts University's Nutritional Science Division spent years mapping actual bone tissue architecture, and what they found is that calcium by itself doesn't know where to go. Without adequate magnesium, the enzymes that regulate calcium transport lose their direction. The calcium circulates. It may even accumulate, but in the wrong places. Arterial walls instead of trabecular matrix, soft tissue instead of cortical bone. A body can look calcium sufficient on a dietary log and be calcium misallocated in practice, and the bone never receives what was theoretically delivered to it. The Tufts work identified something else. Vitamin K2, not K1, which handles clotting and collects most of the attention. K2 activates a protein called osteocalcin. Osteocalcin is the routing system. It directs calcium into the bone matrix, anchors it there, helps mineralize the collagen scaffolding that gives bone its combination of rigidity and flex. Without K2, osteocalcin stays inactive. The supply line is open and the receiving end is shut. Most standard labs don't test for K2 status. Most clinical guidelines don't flag its absence. So a patient can present with bone loss and leave with a calcium supplement and a bisphosphonate prescription, and neither the clinician nor the patient knows the real problem was never the calcium. Magnesium insufficiency affects an estimated 50 to 60% of American adults, according to NIH data. Not marginal, clinical. And the richest dietary sources of K2, aged hard cheeses, natto, certain organ meats, have largely disappeared from how most Americans eat. Two cofactors that bone requires to do its own rebuilding work have been quietly missing from the picture for decades, and that information has not made it from the specialty literature into the room where you get your diagnosis. The exercise piece cuts just as deep, because most of what gets recommended is exactly the wrong prescription. Cardio, walking, swimming, cycling. The activities doctors reach for when someone over 50 asks what they should be doing. The problem is bone doesn't respond to aerobic load the way cardiovascular tissue does. It responds to mechanical stress. Impact, resistance. The piezoelectric effect, the electrical signal generated when bone is compressed under load, is what triggers osteoblast activity, the actual cellular process of building new tissue. Swimming has almost no piezoelectric effect on bone. Cycling has very little. Walking has some, but not enough to meaningfully stimulate formation in someone already experiencing loss. The British Journal of Sports Medicine, drawing on multiple controlled trials, found that high-impact activities, jumping, jogging, resistance training with real load, produced measurable increases in bone mineral density in postmenopausal women. In 12 months, the architecture improved in ways that showed on DEXA imaging, and the threshold was lower than most people assume, 2 to 3 sessions a week, with enough resistance to make the muscles work against something real. That was sufficient to change the signal the bone received and change how the bone answered. This is where the law of vibration and the law of attraction enter the picture, not as comfort, but as mechanism. Every stimulus in that research operates on frequency. Mechanical load generates an electrical signal at a specific frequency. The bone tissue responds or doesn't respond based on whether that frequency registers as a reason to build. What you direct energy toward, with consistency and specificity, is what gets reinforced at the cellular level, not as metaphor. The body's resources follow attention and repetition. That's not inspiration. That's the operating principle underneath every formation marker that moved in those studies. What the Osteoporosis International findings, the Tufts nutritional work, and the British Journal of Sports Medicine trials describe collectively is a system that remains genuinely responsive well into the decades. Most people have been told the conversation is finished. The bone tissue doesn't stop receiving signals after menopause. The remineralization machinery doesn't lock at 60. The cells responsible for building are still present, still reactive, still waiting for the inputs that tell them building is called for, inputs that were simply never provided, or provided in the wrong form, or crowded out by a narrative that mistook the absence of stimulus for an absence of capacity. That distinction matters more than any single finding in any single journal, because one of those things is a biological limit. The other is a correctable error, and the research, read carefully, points toward the second one. The question that follows is obvious and uncomfortable. If the bone remains this responsive, if the cofactors are this identifiable, the exercise prescription this specific, the window this much wider than anyone explained to you, why is this not the first conversation in the clinic? Why does the pharmacological intervention reach the patient before the magnesium level is ever checked? There's an answer to that. You should have it before you make another decision about your bone health. 3 years ago, a document landed in the medical literature that should have changed everything. It didn't make the news. It didn't trend. It was read by a narrow group of specialists, filed behind a paywall, and quietly absorbed into the category of things the field technically knows and practically ignores. Most people who needed to understand what it said never had the chance, because no one translated it for them. That is not a neutral fact. That is a choice the system made, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment before moving forward. The American Society for Bone and Mineral Research released a position paper in 2021 arguing that the foundational model of bone medicine wasn't incomplete or in need of refinement. It was wrong. Wrong in its orientation. Wrong in what it had decided to treat as the starting point. The model that has governed clinical practice for decades works like this. A patient, usually a woman, usually past 65, falls. She fractures something. Imaging is done. Bone density is measured. Osteoporosis is diagnosed. Medication is prescribed. The fracture was the entry point. The fracture was what made her visible to the system. The ASPMR paper was asking why the fracture had to be the first data point at all. That question sounds simple. It isn't. It carries inside it a decades-long failure of prioritization. A failure that affects a very specific population, at a very specific time, when the window for meaningful change is still open. Not permanently open, not infinitely forgiving, but genuinely present. And the system has been consistently looking away from it, not because it doesn't know better, but because knowing better and acting on that knowledge are two different institutional commitments. Dr. Amy Lacken, a longevity physician working at the crossroads of preventive endocrinology and lifestyle medicine, says something in patient consultations that most physicians don't say. She says it plainly, which is part of why it lands the way it does. Bone loss that leads to a fracture at 68 typically began its measurable, traceable decline around 44. Not as a rough approximation, as a documented window, one that was reversible, and that the standard system missed entirely because no one was looking, because the standard system had decided it wasn't time to look yet. The biology of that trajectory is not subtle. Bone mineral density loss in women begins accelerating through the perimenopausal transition, late 30s into the mid-40s, and in the 5 to 7 years following menopause, the rate of loss runs between 2 and 3% per year. That is not a slow erosion. That is the skeleton quietly restructuring itself, while the person living inside it is focused on everything else, receiving no signal from the medical system that anything requiring attention is happening. In 2023, the Endocrine Society updated its clinical practice guidelines on osteoporosis. The updated guidelines maintain that routine DEXA scanning, the bone density imaging that can detect loss before any fracture occurs, is generally indicated for women beginning at 65 and for men at 70. Those numbers have been standard for years. They are also, according to a growing and credentialed portion of the bone research community, dangerously misaligned with what the biology actually requires. Because the biology isn't waiting until 65. The biology is making consequential decisions about the internal scaffolding of bone, the trabecular microarchitecture that determines whether a bone bends or gives under load, while the patient is still running, still working, still believing the body is managing fine. The DEXA guideline structurally catches the damage after most of it is already done. The Endocrine Society's position here is not ignorance. It is a calculation. It weighs radiation exposure, which is minimal, against cost, which is moderate, against what the insurance apparatus will absorb, which is governed by actuarial logic rather than biological timing. The result is a standard of care that is financially coherent and clinically insufficient. That gap between financial coherence and clinical sufficiency is where a significant number of people in their late 40s and early 50s are currently living, without being told they are there. What the ASPMR paper argued, and what a meaningful segment of the bone and mineral research community has been building toward, is that risk stratification should begin at 45 for patients with identifiable risk factors, not 65 as a universal default, 45 as an active clinical question, asked during a routine appointment, while the patient is still inside the window where intervention changes the long-term trajectory. The risk factors are not rare. They are not exotic genetic conditions. They are the ordinary composition of a typical life. Chronic dietary calcium insufficiency, not severe deficiency, just the sustained low-grade kind that doesn't produce symptoms, only a quiet redirection of calcium away from bone storage and toward the blood's more urgent mineral demands. Vitamin D insufficiency, which national survey data has consistently found affects roughly 40% of American adults. Sedentary work patterns that remove the mechanical load from the skeleton that bone remodeling requires in order to stay active, and high cortisol exposure from sustained psychological stress, which directly suppresses osteoblast activity, the cellular process responsible for building new bone, while simultaneously accelerating osteoclast activity, the process that breaks it down. Alcohol consumption at levels most people would describe as moderate, 2 drinks daily, sustained over years, measurably suppresses bone formation independent of other variables. This comes from a 2020 analysis in Osteoporosis International. It is almost never raised in primary care conversations. The body doesn't operate a dedicated bone health department that runs independently of everything else. It runs a single integrated system that reads signals about safety, resource availability, and threat level, and allocates its maintenance capacity accordingly. When the signal reads sustained threat, elevated cortisol, chronic sympathetic activation, the physiological signature of a life under pressure, maintenance functions are suppressed, not eliminated, suppressed. The organism is making a rational short-term calculation. If something dangerous appears to be happening, the energy required to rebuild bone tissue is more urgently needed elsewhere. The problem is when that short-term calculation stops being short-term, when it becomes the default setting, when the body is running on a signal it received years ago and was never told to update. This is not a peripheral detail in the bone health conversation. It is close to the center of it, and it is the part that the standard care model has the most difficulty addressing, because it cannot be solved with a prescription, and the standard model has organized itself around what prescriptions can reach. The Aspmer position paper does acknowledge lifestyle factors. It notes that exercise, nutrition, and fall prevention are important adjuncts to pharmacological treatment. That word, adjuncts, is doing significant work. It places lifestyle intervention as supplemental to medication. The medication remains primary. What the longevity medicine community has been arguing, with increasing directness, is that for a patient in their late 40s who has not fractured, whose density is declining but hasn't crossed the clinical threshold for diagnosis, the lifestyle intervention isn't supplemental. It is the primary tool, and it is being functionally withheld, not because it lacks evidence, but because the system has no reimbursable mechanism to deliver it. The gap between what the research supports and what the standard protocol offers is not the product of ignorance. The evidence for earlier intervention is in the journals. The specialists who argue for it publish in the same peer-reviewed venues and present at the same conferences as those who write the guidelines. The window is documented. The tools are available. The cost of early intervention is a fraction of the cost of fracture management. What this means, practically, is that the work of responding to this gap cannot wait for the system to realign itself. The person who is 47 or 52 or 55 and has never been told their bones are in an active phase of change, that person is not going to receive that information through a routine appointment. Not yet, not within the current structure, which means that how they receive this information now, what they do with it, and whether they allow it to move them toward action or sit with it as another heavy fact in a long list of heavy facts. That is not a clinical question. That is a question about the inner posture from which someone engages with their own life. An inner posture, it turns out, is not incidental to bone health. According to the same mechanisms this chapter has been describing, it may be closer to foundational than any guideline currently acknowledges. Here is what no one tells you about doing everything right. You woke up early. You made it to the gym 4 times a week. You gave up the red meat, cut back on the alcohol, scheduled your annual physical like clockwork. You had your cholesterol checked. You had your blood pressure checked. You had your PSA checked if you're a man, your mammogram if you're a woman. You did the things, the exact things they told you to do, and somewhere in a filing cabinet or a patient portal you log into once a year, there is a record of every one of those appointments. Clean results, reassuring numbers, the language of a person who is taking care of themselves. So here is the question. Why would a person like that, disciplined, consistent, doing everything by the book, arrive at 53 or 57 with a fracture from a fall that should have been minor, and discover in the emergency room that their skeleton has been quietly hollowing out for a decade? Not negligence, not laziness, not bad luck in any random sense. A gap in the system so wide, so institutionally routine, that most people living inside it have never once been told it exists. Osteoporosis affects approximately 10 million Americans. Another 44 million have low bone density, a condition called osteopenia, sitting directly in the anteroom of osteoporosis, waiting. That is more than half the adult population over 50 in this country living inside a risk profile that, for the majority of them, has never been the subject of a serious conversation with a physician. The numbers are not contested. The gap between the people who have low bone density and the people who have been told about it, screened for it, had a single targeted conversation about it, that gap is not a few percentage points. It is structural. It is built into how standard of care is designed. Here is what that design looks like from the inside. A woman in her late 40s sits across from her primary care physician. She is fit. She exercises. She eats reasonably well. Her blood work comes back in a normal range. The doctor has 11 minutes with her. That is the national average for a primary care appointment in the United States. And there are 3 items on the agenda already: cholesterol, blood pressure, a skin concern she flagged when she scheduled. The 11 minutes fills quickly. Bone density does not come up. Not because her doctor is incompetent, not because he does not care, but because the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force does not recommend bone density screening for women until age 65. For postmenopausal women under 65 with specific risk factors, 60. For men, the guidance is even more ambiguous. There is no universal recommendation at all. 45 to 55 is not in the protocol. It is not on the checklist. The checklist does not have a line for it. The doctor says everything looks good and means it. Everything does look good on the metrics that were measured. This is what makes osteoporosis distinct from almost every other chronic condition that stalks people in their 50s. Cancer has markers. Cardiovascular disease has a cascade of warning signs: blood pressure, inflammation, lipid panels that modern medicine actively hunts. Diabetes has fasting glucose, A1C. Even depression, a condition that lives entirely inside subjective experience, has screening tools that have worked their way into routine annual visits. Bone density has none of that ambient surveillance in the years when bone loss is already underway. The biology does not help either. Bone is not an inert scaffold. It is living tissue, constantly broken down and rebuilt in a process called remodeling. In your 20s, the rebuilding outpaces the breakdown. You are running a surplus. By 35, the balance starts shifting. After 50, especially in women following the hormonal drop of menopause, breakdown can outpace rebuilding significantly. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but steadily, quietly, year after year, with nothing sent to the surface. No ache, no stiffness, no morning signal that something is changing at a structural level. The first symptom for a third of people with osteoporosis is a fracture. Hip, spine, wrist, often from an impact that someone in their 40s simply should not break a bone from: a stumble, a misstep, a fall from standing height. The medical term for this is a fragility fracture. There is something honest in that phrase. The National Bone Health Alliance released an analysis examining the lag between when bone density loss begins and when it is formally detected. In women between 45 and 55, only about 12% had ever had a DXA scan, the gold standard bone density test that takes less than 15 minutes, costs a fraction of most routine diagnostics, and gives a clear picture of where you stand. 12%. In a group where measurable bone loss is already biologically underway for the majority of them. The reasons stack in layers. Insurance coding often requires a physician's documented concern before a scan is approved for someone under 65. The physician's documented concern is rarely present because symptoms are absent and protocols do not flag it. The patient does not raise it because they do not know to. No friction anywhere in the system interrupts the silence. Dr. Dolores Schobeck, whose work at the University of California, San Francisco has focused on these premenopausal and early postmenopausal years, has noted that the decade between 45 and 55 is almost paradoxically the most critical window, the years when intervention is most effective, and also the years most consistently overlooked by standard care. The American Society for Bone and Mineral Research has issued position statements on what they call the diagnostic gap. The language in those documents is careful, clinical, and essentially devastating if you read it slowly. A large proportion of fracture events occur in individuals who were never identified as being at elevated risk. Never identified, not mismanaged, never identified. Think about the identity many people carry into that doctor's office. Not passively, actively. They arrive having made real sacrifices, the workouts when it was cold, the meals they skipped, the sleep they protected. There is a sense, earned and legitimate, that they are holding up their end of the deal, that the system will catch what they cannot see. When the fracture comes, it is not only physical. Something shifts underneath the injury itself, because it suggests the deal was not symmetrical. That there was a whole category of risk the system was quietly not tracking through all those years of doing everything right. That is not paranoia. That is an accurate reading of how standard of care operates within frameworks built for cost-effectiveness and statistical populations. Frameworks that structurally underweight risks without visible symptoms. Here is what matters, though. The system is not malicious toward you. There is a difference between a system that is cruel and a system that is structurally incomplete. Understanding that difference is not about letting anyone off the hook. It changes what you do next. And this is where the law of vibration and the law of attraction stop being abstract, because they are practical tools precisely here in this moment. The person who leaves that appointment feeling like a victim of institutional indifference will vibrate at exactly that frequency going forward. Contracted, defensive, waiting to be failed again. That internal state is not neutral. It shapes what information you seek, what questions you ask, whether you walk back in or stay away. It shapes the hormonal environment your body runs on. The law of attraction is not mysticism in this context. It is the observable fact that the internal signal you broadcast determines which doors you notice and which ones you walk past without seeing. The person who understands they are moving through a gap, a real, documented, systemic gap that is not personal, orients differently. They ask specifically for the DXA scan. They bring the name of the protocol. They do not wait for permission. They are pulling toward them the exact information they need from a state of agency rather than grievance. That difference in internal frequency is the difference between two entirely different outcomes in the same 11-minute appointment. You are not the object of this system. You are someone moving through a gap it left open. That is not a small distinction. So here is where you actually stand. The gap is real. The screening delay is real. The biology is already running its quiet process whether the protocol acknowledges it or not. None of that is in your control. What is in your control? You know the name of the test. You know the age range the system misses. You know that 12% number, which means 88% of people in your window have never had this conversation, and you are now one of the 12 who has. That is not a cliffhanger. That is an edge, and it is yours right now, not at some future appointment you haven't made yet. The question of whether bone rebuilds, whether the body can be brought back from a deficit rather than simply slowed in its decline, that is a real question with a real answer. And the answer runs through something most protocols never touch. The internal hormonal environment that governs whether your body is running a reconstruction budget or a defense budget at any given moment. Whether it is rebuilding or protecting, whether the cellular signal favors formation or breakdown. You have more influence over that signal than the standard of care has ever told you. And you are already in motion. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with how hard you worked. You know it by feel. The legs aren't burning, the lungs aren't heaving, but something underneath all of that has gone quiet in a way that doesn't recover with rest. A flatness, not muscular. Older than that and harder to locate. Most people assume it's psychological, mood, motivation, the ordinary friction of a difficult season. The research suggests something more specific. That flatness has a hormonal address, and bone tissue is one of the first places you can read it. Start with a body that has been carrying low-grade vigilance for a long time, not crisis. Not acute stress. The ordinary kind, the jaw that sets slightly when the phone rings, the breath that never quite reaches the lower ribs, the way the weight shifts forward onto the balls of the feet when the day loads up. A woman in her late 50s stands in her kitchen in the early morning. The light is flat and gray. She is already running the list of things that could go wrong before lunch. Her shoulders sit an inch higher than they need to. Her exhale is short. This is not dramatic. This is Tuesday. And inside this ordinary Tuesday, a cascade of decisions is being made at the hormonal level that she cannot feel and has not been told to notice. The body runs two operating systems, and they compete for the same budget. One is organized around threat. It sharpens immediate perception, contracts peripheral tissue, reroutes energy away from long-term investment and toward whatever is coming next. The other is organized around construction, remineralization, repair, the laying down of new bone matrix by cells that only do that work when the system judges the conditions safe enough to spend resources on the future. These two systems do not take turns. They bid against each other, and threat spending carries priority, always. What researchers publishing in psychoneuroendocrinology have been mapping with increasing precision, and what has largely failed to reach the mainstream conversation about bone health, is the degree to which that bidding process responds to something other than calcium intake, supplement protocols, or exercise volume. It responds to whether the nervous system is reading the environment as safe, not whether you believe it is safe, not whether you tell yourself to relax, whether the body's own measurement systems are returning a safety signal in the baroreceptors, in the vagus nerve, in the breath pattern, and the postural geometry that the brainstem reads as data about the state of the world. When that signal comes through clearly, the anabolic profile assembles. IGF-1 rises, insulin-like growth factor, the molecule that communicates to osteoblasts that construction is worth the investment. Growth hormone follows a more favorable secretion pattern. Testosterone, in both men and women through different pathways, holds at concentrations that support density rather than ceding ground to the catabolic compounds that dominate a stress-saturated system. The difference in IGF-1 concentration between a body running in sustained low-grade threat and a body genuinely downregulated out of that state is not marginal. It is reproducible, measurable, and biologically meaningful in exactly the tissue we are discussing. Now return to the woman in the kitchen. She puts down the phone before it rings, or she doesn't pick it up immediately. She notices the set of her shoulders and lets them drop, not because someone told her to practice good posture, but because something in her has decided, just for a moment, to stop carrying the ceiling. Her breath drops into her lower ribs. Her weight settles back onto her heels. These are small adjustments, barely visible to someone watching. But the vagus nerve, which runs from the brainstem down through the chest and abdomen, is reading different input now. The baroreceptors in the aortic arch are registering a different pressure signature. The hypothalamic pituitary axis, which governs the hormonal cascade that either builds or defends, is updating its calculation. The body reads erect posture and unguarded breath, the way an animal reads the stillness after a storm, as evidence that the threat has passed, that resources can now be redirected toward repair. There is a texture to this moment when it happens genuinely. A slight warmth behind the sternum, a weight that settles into the back of the thighs rather than hovering at the front of them. The sound a floorboard makes when you land your full weight on it rather than tiptoeing across it. These are the sensory signatures of a system coming out of defense. And bone tissue registers the hormonal consequences of that shift the way soil registers rain after a dry season. Not instantly, but really, at the cellular level, with structural response that accumulates over weeks and months. This is why the quality of internal state during movement matters as much as the movement itself. Walking with the jaw set and the breath held shallow, grinding through exercise because you are afraid of what the next bone density scan will reveal, moving the body as punishment for its fragility. These are not neutral inputs. The tissue receives them as data. The hormonal cascade that follows reflects them with biochemical precision. Osteoblasts are not passive. When conditions permit, they are actively laying down collagen matrix, mineralizing it in precise crystalline architecture, responding to the mechanical signals that load-bearing generates. But they will not run that process at full capacity in an environment dominated by the compounds of chronic alert. The budget does not allow it. Defense spending comes first. Walking with the weight fully accepted reads differently at the cellular level. Lifting something because the body was built to lift, not because you are racing a diagnosis, generates a different hormonal signature, not because the mind is telling a better story, because the nervous system is receiving different input and governing its chemistry accordingly. One path is motivation, the other is physiology. The distinction is everything. There is a particular quality to the movement of someone whose nervous system is not scanning. You can hear it in how their feet land. You can see it in the pause before they begin something physically demanding. The breath that actually drops before the effort begins. The absence of the pre-bracing that other bodies do without knowing. That quality is not a personality. It is a state. And states are trainable, not through rehearsal of the right thoughts, but through the body itself. Through posture held long enough to shift the vagal reading, through breath that reaches far enough to alter the baroreceptor signal, through movement that loads the skeleton with the confidence of a structure that expects to be used. What the research from psychoneuroendocrinology makes difficult to dismiss is its refusal of the soft interpretation. This is not about cultivating optimism. It is about the measurable endocrine difference between a body that moves through the day contracted and scanning, and a body that has downregulated that vigilance enough to run the reconstruction program. The construction program, when it runs, is active and energy-intensive and molecularly specific. Osteoblasts working in an anabolic hormonal environment are not the same tissue as osteoblasts working in a catabolic one. The body that walks through the day in a genuine state of physiological security is not just feeling better. It is becoming different at the structural level over time. That capacity to use an anabolic environment to complete the remineralization that favorable hormonal conditions now permit depends on something more specific still, on mechanical signals. Concrete, load-bearing, directionally precise input that bone tissue reads as direct instruction rather than ambient permission. Not the signal of calm, but the targeted force that the osteoblast interprets as a command to build here, in this direction, at this density. What those signals are exactly, and how precisely they reach the tissue where the work needs to happen. That is the next layer. There is a moment, And you may have already had it more than once, when something in the body responds before the mind has formed the intention. Not a warning, not a malfunction, just evidence that a system older than your conscious self is running calculations you never asked it to run. You walk downstairs in the dark and your hand finds the rail. You shift weight onto a foot you cannot quite see, and the ankle makes 20 small decisions in the time it takes you to exhale. The body is not failing in those moments. It is doing what it was built to do. The question is whether what it is being given, the terrain, the timing, the depth of sleep, the quality of what comes after effort, is enough to keep that system doing it well. Earlier, the question was left open. What are the specific practices that current science actually links to bone health? Not the obvious ones, not the calcium commercials, not the ones mentioned while the doctor was already reaching for the door handle, but the ones that exist in peer-reviewed research and almost never make it into a real conversation with a real person. Here are 3, not as a list, as scenes from lives that are already being lived or could be. The first scene is a patch of uneven ground, not a trail in a park with a map and a water station. Something rougher, a field edge, a gravel lot, a path that forces the foot to make a decision 20 times a minute instead of once. The ankle adjusts, the knee compensates, and somewhere deep in the architecture of the femur, the tibia, the heel bone cells that have been waiting for a signal receive one. Osteoblasts, the builders. They respond to mechanical load the way a muscle responds to resistance. They activate, they deposit, they rebuild. But here is the part that rarely appears in conversations about bone health. The load has to be unpredictable. Flat surface walking does real work. It moves the cardiovascular system. It moves the lymph. But for bone, the signal that matters is novelty of impact. The skeleton is listening for something it didn't see coming. It is a system built for an older world, a world of uneven ground, of sudden weight shifts, of bodies that stumbled and caught themselves. When that input disappears, when every surface is flat, every step cushioned, every morning is the same treadmill on the same setting, the bone stops receiving the message it needs, which is why the research has been quietly pointing somewhere unexpected. Simple jumping, not high-impact plyometrics, not anything requiring a gym membership or a certification, but the kind of jumping a child does without thinking. 10 jumps, 20, done consistently over months. The Oklahoma State University study published in the American Journal of Health Promotion tracked premenopausal women doing exactly that 10 to 20 jumps twice daily and measured significantly improved hip bone density compared to controls. The mechanism isn't complicated. It is a spike of ground reaction force traveling up through the skeletal system, landing on the osteoblast like a knock on a door that says, "We still need you." Build. The smell of the old warehouse air, cold metal, damp concrete. The body is already more alert just being in a place like that. The second scene takes place in the 45 minutes after effort, not the effort itself. What comes after? A man 60s, not an athlete, walks 4 mornings a week, finishes his loop through the neighborhood and comes inside. He makes coffee. He showers. Sometimes he eats something, sometimes he waits. That window, whether he eats protein in it or doesn't, turns out to matter more than he knows. The University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston has done more sustained work on muscle protein synthesis in aging adults than almost any other institution in the country. Their research on what they call anabolic resistance, the reduced capacity of older muscle and bone to respond to protein signals, is not widely discussed outside of sports medicine and geriatric research, but it should be. What they found, across multiple trials involving adults over 50, is that the post-exercise window is the body's moment of maximum receptivity. After mechanical stress, even mild stress, even a long walk, the tissue opens. Protein that would otherwise be processed at a slower rate gets directed towards synthesis. The rebuilding signal is live. The practical consequence is not dramatic. It doesn't require a shaker bottle or a complicated supplement. It requires proximity, getting protein into the body within an hour of the effort. Not because the rest of the day doesn't count, but because that particular window is when the door is widest. A piece of fish, eggs, Greek yogurt, the texture of something real. The body at that moment is not indifferent to what it receives. It is paying attention. The man making coffee after his walk doesn't know the biochemistry. But if he eats something real before the hour is gone, the tissue responds as if it does. The third scene happens at night, which is why most people miss it. Somewhere between the first deep sleep cycle and the second, the pituitary gland, a structure the size of a pea, sitting at the base of the brain, begins to release growth hormone in pulses. Not a constant drip. Pulses. Spikes. The largest secretion of growth hormone in a 24-hour period happens in those early hours of deep, slow-wave sleep. And growth hormone is the primary anabolic signal the skeleton uses to rebuild. The bone does not rebuild in the afternoon. It does not rebuild at the desk or on the commute or during the news. It rebuilds at night, in the dark, during the sleep that most people over 50 are quietly and consistently failing to protect. Not because they don't want sleep, because they have accepted a version of night that is too shallow, too interrupted, too lit, too caffeinated at the wrong hours, and the body, tolerant to a fault, has stopped protesting loudly enough to be heard. What happens to the pituitary pulse when sleep is fragmented? It diminishes. The spike that should rise sharply in deep, slow-wave sleep flattens. The signal the bone depends on, the one that tells the osteoblast that tonight is a building night, arrives weak, or doesn't fully arrive at all. And the skeleton, patient and silent, waits for a signal that the modern night keeps interrupting. The cool side of the pillow, the particular weight of real darkness when the phone is in another room. These are not abstractions. They are the conditions under which the pituitary does its actual work. The body is not metaphorically restored during sleep. It is biologically rebuilt during it. Bone tissue is literally assembled in the hours most people have quietly handed over to screens and ambient anxiety. 3 scenes, 3 mechanisms, mechanical novelty, protein timing, slow-wave sleep. None of them require money. None of them require a specialist. But all 3 operate according to a logic that the wellness industry rarely names clearly, which is that the body is not neutral to the conditions it is given. It reads them. It responds to them. There is a principle at work underneath the biochemistry, one that becomes clearer when you look at how these mechanisms actually function. The internal state the body is in, the hormonal environment, the level of stress activation, the quality of recovery, determines what it does with every input it receives. The same protein, the same impact, the same hours of sleep produce different results depending on what the body's deeper signals are already saying. That is worth sitting with. because it means the three scenes above are not the whole picture. They are entry points into something larger, something that connects what the skeleton is building at night to what the mind is doing in the hours before. That connection between inner state and biological outcome opens into a framework that will get its proper space in the next chapter. But there is a more immediate question worth leaving here, because it touches everything that came before. What changes in the body and in the relationship with it when you stop treating it as a system to be monitored for failure, not as a rhetorical move, as a genuine question with a specific answer? Because the posture most people over 45 have been handed, one of surveillance, correction, waiting for the next thing to go wrong, is itself a condition the body is reading, and it is responding to it accordingly. That response is what the next chapter is about. She had been standing at the kitchen counter for 4 minutes before she realized the water she'd poured herself had gone completely still. Not the water, her. That stillness is what this chapter is about, the question threading through everything built here. What happens when you stop treating your body as a problem requiring aggressive management and start treating it as a system that responds to conditions? The answer isn't a supplement. It isn't a protocol. It turns out it's something closer to a decision, and it looks from the outside like nothing at all. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is the woman we met at the beginning, barefoot on a cold tile floor before the house woke up. You remember the quality of silence in a room that hasn't been spoken into yet. She has been reading about osteoporosis for 3 weeks. Bone density scans, T-scores, DEXA imaging. The language of her own skeleton, translated into numbers she doesn't fully understand but has learned to fear. Every morning she brings the weight of those numbers to her body like a report card. Every evening she sets it down without resolution. What she has been doing is treating her body as something broken or potentially breaking that requires constant surveillance. Watch the calcium. Count the steps. Don't fall. Don't lose ground. Don't let the numbers get worse. The calcium tablets sit on the counter beside her coffee maker. She takes them dutifully. The bone density printout is in a folder in the second drawer. She has read it 11 times, and the body, receiving all of this, has been responding not to the calcium, not to the walking, not to the supplements, but to the signal underneath all of it. The signal that says, asterisk, we are under threat. Asterisk, in 2023, researchers at the University of Rochester published findings from a longitudinal study tracking women between the ages of 45 and 65 who had received low to normal bone density diagnoses. The study was measuring something they called interoceptive acceptance, the degree to which a person experiences their body as a cooperative partner versus a failing system requiring constant correction. Participants completed validated psychological assessments at intake, at 6 months, and at 12 months. Blood draws at each interval measured inflammatory cytokines, including interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, both of which are directly implicated in osteoclast activity, the cellular process responsible for bone resorption. What they found was this: women who scored high on interoceptive acceptance at intake showed measurably lower IL-6 levels at 12 months than women who scored high on body vigilance, even when controlling for diet, exercise frequency, and supplement use. The difference was not marginal. It was large enough to affect the researchers' modeling of projected bone mineral density trajectories over 5 years. The mechanism is not subtle once you understand it. Chronic self-directed vigilance, the low, constant monitoring of a body perceived as failing, activates the same physiological stress cascade as external threat. Cortisol elevation, sympathetic nervous system engagement, sustained inflammatory signaling. That cascade, maintained over months and years, suppresses immune coordination and disrupts the bone remodeling cycle, the continuous process by which osteoblasts lay down new matrix and osteoclasts clear the old. When the body perceives threat, it redirects resources. It pulls from maintenance. It delays construction. It holds repair in queue behind more urgent demands. The body doesn't distinguish between a threat arriving from outside and a threat arriving from inside the mind of the person inhabiting it. The surveillance is the threat. There's a particular smell in the folder where she keeps the printout. The faint, slightly metallic smell of printed paper left in a closed drawer. She opened it again this morning. She doesn't know why. She doesn't read it anymore so much as she visits it, the way you might check a wound. The shift, the actual shift, the one the Rochester data is pointing toward, is not about stopping the visits. It's not about pretending the numbers aren't there. It's not resignation. That word matters because people hear acceptance and hear surrender, and those are not the same country. What acceptance looks like in the Rochester data is this. The body is a system that responds to conditions. I am one of those conditions. The state I bring to this system is a variable. That's it. That's the whole refrain. Not. Asterisk my bones are fine and I refuse to worry. Asterisk not. Asterisk I will think positive thoughts about my skeleton. Asterisk but. Asterisk I am not separate from this system. I am part of what it is responding to. If I change the conditions, the system responds differently. Asterisk she put the folder back in the drawer. Not with resolution. Not with some dramatic interior declaration. She put it back the way you put back a book you've already finished, with the quiet recognition that you've already gotten what you came for, and returning won't reveal something new. Then she stood at the counter for another moment, and the kitchen held that particular stillness that happens when a decision has been made without being announced. The sunlight through the window was moving slowly across the floor in that way it does in late morning, the kind of light that has weight to it, warming the tile in a slow diagonal line. She stepped into it, still barefoot, her feet on warm tile instead of cold, the body receiving something different because the body had been brought somewhere different, not forced there, moved there. Cooperation is a harder discipline than control. Control gives you the illusion of agency. You do the right things, you track the right numbers, you follow the right protocol, and the feedback, even when it's bad feedback, feels like information within a system you're running. You are the one driving. Cooperation requires you to acknowledge that the body has its own intelligence, that it has been running adaptive processes for 45 or 50 or 60 years without asking permission, that the skeletal remodeling cycle, the inflammatory regulation, the hormonal cascades involved in bone density, none of that is waiting for your approval. It's happening continuously in response to conditions. You are a condition. The Rochester study captured something else inside the same dataset. Women who had shifted from a vigilance posture to an acceptance posture didn't just show reduced inflammatory markers. They showed increased engagement with health behaviors, but with a different quality of engagement. Less rigid, less anxious, more consistent, better adherence to the behaviors that actually move bone density outcomes. Because when the body is experienced as an adversary, even the right behaviors arrive inside a field of hostility. The walk happens, but with clenched teeth. The calcium is taken as a concession to a failing system, and the body is receiving all of that. The biochemical environment those behaviors travel through is shaped by the state accompanying them. Cooperation changes the field. The same walk, taken differently, arrives somewhere different. She's not done with the numbers. She'll have another DEXA scan. She'll keep track. That's not the part that's changing. What's changing is the relationship inside which the tracking happens. Whether the body is the opponent, or whether the body is, and this word is being used precisely, a asterisk partner asterisk in an ongoing exchange. Something that will tell you what it needs, if you can stop issuing corrections long enough to receive the report. The cold tile at 5 in the morning had something to tell her. The way certain movements hurt and others didn't. The way sleep felt different on nights when she hadn't spent the evening in the folder. The body was reporting. It had always been reporting. She had been too busy managing to listen. That's what shifts first, not the calcium levels, not the T-score, not the scan results. The listening. And from the listening, the conditions change. And from the conditions, the system responds. She stood in the line of slow morning light, feet flat on the warm tile, and the house was still quiet around her. Nothing announced, nothing resolved. Just a woman and her body briefly in the same place at the same time, neither one running ahead of the other. That's what the research is actually measuring. That's the variable the vigilance model leaves out. You stayed. Not with it, through it. There is a difference worth naming. 14 chapters of material that does not offer the usual compensations. No quick fix, no reassuring oversimplification, no clean protocol handed over at the end of each section to create the sensation of having handled something. You moved through the biology of bone remodeling, the institutionalized silence around skeletal decline, the emotional architecture the body stores and the skeleton eventually answers for, the window of response that most people never know is open. None of it was simple. All of it asked something of you, and you gave it. That turns out to matter more than this video has yet said directly. Here is what the evidence says about why. In 2019, researchers at the University of Pittsburgh published a study in Psychosomatic Medicine examining what they called interoceptive accuracy, the ability to accurately perceive internal bodily signals, and its relationship to physiological regulation. The findings were not small. Individuals who scored higher on interoceptive awareness, meaning they paid sustained, non-anxious attention to what their bodies were doing, showed measurably lower systemic inflammation markers, better autonomic regulation, and more coherent heart rate variability patterns. Not because they had changed their diet, not because they had added a training protocol. The distinguishing variable was the quality of attention they brought to their own interior experience, curious rather than braced, witnessing rather than managing. The researchers were careful, the way careful researchers are. They did not claim that attention heals. What they documented was more specific than that. The nervous system reads the quality of attention directed inward and responds to it biochemically. A body monitored under the gaze of fear holds a low-grade defensive posture. A body held under open, investigative attention receives a different signal from the brain. One, the autonomic nervous system translates into a measurably different internal environment. The skeleton lives inside that environment. We have spent a significant portion of this video talking about bone, its silences, its vulnerabilities, the way it speaks in fractures after decades of ignored messages. But bone is not inert infrastructure waiting passively for calcium and sunlight and the correct supplementation schedule. Bone tissue is innervated. It is wired. The periosteum, the membrane covering bone, is dense with sensory nerve fibers in constant dialogue with the central nervous system. The stress response, cortisol, catecholamines, sympathetic activation, suppresses osteoblast activity not as an abstract metabolic footnote, but through those fibers. Through a conversation happening right now, in your ribs, in your vertebrae, in the long cortical bones of your femur, in the fine trabecular lattice of your wrists. Change the conversation the nervous system is having, and the bone tissue sits inside a different internal climate. A 2021 study from the Karolinska Institute, published in the Asterisk Journal of Bone and Mineral Research Asterisk, examined the relationship between autonomic nervous system tone and bone mineral density in women over 50. The findings were striking enough that the lead researcher noted publicly that the skeleton is more sensitive to psychological state than the field has historically assumed. Participants with higher parasympathetic tone, the branch of the nervous system associated with safety, rest, and repair, showed significantly better bone density outcomes even after controlling for physical activity, calcium intake, and hormonal status. Parasympathetic tone is the body's working assessment of whether it is safe. That assessment updates continuously, moment by moment, drawing on signals from the environment and from inside the body itself. Attention is one of those signals, one of the ways the body takes its own reading of the interior. Whether that attention arrives armored or open, scanning for threat or moving with genuine curiosity, it registers. The body votes on it, and the skeleton, given enough time, reflects the accumulated result. So when this video suggests that moving through its full length was already a form of recalibration, the claim is not motivational. It is mechanistic. You spent roughly an hour holding your own body in focus without the standard defensive overlay, without the physician's calibrated alarm, designed to produce just enough anxiety to sustain attention, without the supplement advertisement that requires you to feel broken in order to offer repair. The attention here was asked to be investigative, steady, and genuinely open. If it landed that way, even partially, the autonomic nervous system registered the difference. The tissue sat inside a slightly different internal climate for this hour than it usually does. That is the synthesis. Not in any single chapter, not in the studies, however important they are, not in the specific minerals, the mechanical load protocols, the hormonal landscape, the emotional archaeology of stored stress, all of which are real and all of which matter. The synthesis is in the through line connecting every layer, that the skeleton is a living record of the internal environment sustained over decades, and that the internal environment is still responsive, right now, to the quality of presence brought to it. A body that has received a chronic signal of low-grade threat for years has not locked in that outcome permanently. The tissue is still in conversation. The assessment is still being updated. The system is not closed. This is precisely what gets buried under the institutional silence described earlier in this video. The silence of a healthcare model that waits for the fracture, that treats bone as passive infrastructure rather than as living tissue running a continuous dialogue with the nervous system. What gets buried underneath that model is the open window. Not open without conditions. Not open indefinitely regardless of what happens next, but open now for a body that is still breathing and still capable of receiving a different signal than the one it has been receiving. On a cold morning, wood smoke reaching through a window left slightly ajar, present before any decision about whether to let it in, already in the room before the question forms. That is the quality of permeability the evidence points toward. Not willed, not effortful, a state the nervous system settles into when the attention directed inward stops bracing and starts looking with something closer to interest. Your body just spent an hour in that orientation rather than the usual one. The question the evidence raises and leaves genuinely open, not rhetorically, is what the hours after this one look like. Whether what shifted here extends beyond the screen into the texture of ordinary days, whether the signal sent into the tissue during this hour can be returned to, practiced, deepened outside the container of a structured video. That is not a small question, and it does not have a tidy answer. But it is the right question to be sitting with, which is a different position than most people occupy when this subject finally reaches them, usually through a fracture, usually through a number on a scan, usually through a system that delivers the information far too late and frames it as damage rather than as an open conversation still worth entering. You entered it earlier than that. That is the thing that actually changes outcomes. So here's where we are. You've been sitting with osteoporosis for the last hour, not the clinical version, not the pamphlet you get handed at a GP appointment with a diagram of a crumbling vertebra and a list of calcium-rich foods. The actual thing. What the research says about how bone loses density silently, over years, while the person living inside that skeleton goes about their life assuming the structure is holding. The way chronic cortisol elevation, the long, low hum of sustained stress, actively interferes with the cells responsible for building new bone. The way menopause, vitamin D insufficiency, sedentary work, and even grief compound in tissue. The way you can have lost 30% of your bone mass before a single symptom registers. That's not a metaphor. That's what the scans show. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, if you were paying attention, you probably felt something shift, not dramatically, not like a revelation, but quietly. The way a room changes when a window is opened, the same air moving differently. Outside right now it's late afternoon wherever you are. The light has probably changed since you started watching. Your coffee, if you made one, is cold. You've been still for a long time, which is its own kind of information. The body doesn't stay still unless something is holding its attention. Notice that. The small weight of your feet on the floor. The fact that you are right now standing on a skeleton that has been building and rebuilding itself your entire life without asking for your permission or your awareness. That's what today was actually about. Not fear, not a checklist. The quiet, continuous work that happens inside a structure you rarely think about until something goes wrong, and what it means to start thinking about it before that. Here's what I want to say plainly, without dressing it up. If this is the kind of hour you want to spend regularly, where something real gets reported without being softened and then turned until you can see it from the inside, this channel does this every week. One subject, the full weight of it, no shortcuts. Subscribe if that's useful to you. Not as a favor, not for the algorithm, just because consistency is the only thing that makes this kind of work accumulate into something. 1 hour doesn't change much. 40 hours over a year starts to change how you hear things. That's the only pitch there is. What's coming in the final chapter, and it's shorter than anything else in this video, is a single question about the body. Not a research question. Not something that requires a study to answer. Something that only requires attention, which you've already been practicing for the last hour whether you noticed it or not. After everything said today about bone, about density and silence, and the slow arithmetic of gain and loss inside a structure you carry everywhere, there's one more thing to hand you before you leave. Stand up when you watch it if you can, or don't. But feel the floor. She's standing in the kitchen again. Same floor, same early hour. The tile is cold against the soles of her feet, that specific cold of ceramic in a house that hasn't warmed yet. She didn't put on slippers. She takes a step toward the counter, and she hears it. Not a crack, not a grind, not the sound she'd been quietly dreading in the months since her doctor said the word osteopenia, the way doctors say things they hope you won't ask about too deeply. Something else entirely. The soft compression of weight across a structure that is, on this morning, in this moment, holding. The faint give of the arch. The almost imperceptible flex at the metatarsal. The body moving forward. She's heard that sound 1,000 mornings. She never listened to it before. 50 minutes ago we started with a woman and a cold floor and a silence she didn't know how to read. We said the bones were sending signals. We said the silence wasn't emptiness. Here is what needed the full hour to earn. Bone tissue responds to what structural biology calls mechanical loading. Load the bone and it signals. The signal recruits osteoblasts, the builders. Silence the load and the signal fades. The builders stand down. The tissue thins. Standard explanation. Most doctors stop there. But the bone doesn't only respond to weight. It responds to the nervous system that carries the weight, to the hormonal environment the body produces while bearing it, to the chronic internal state of the organism in which all of that is happening. Researchers took decades to document this. The clinical world still hasn't absorbed it into its standard conversations, with patients sitting across a desk being handed a pamphlet. The bone is listening to you even when you're not listening to it. We talked this hour about magnesium, not the headline mineral, the one that makes it onto the bottles with the largest font, but the quiet variable in the chain that the headline minerals require to function. We talked about D3 and K2 not as separate supplements competing for shelf space, but as a relay, one handing off to the other. We talked about collagen as structural scaffolding laid during sleep, during recovery, during the hours nobody is selling anything because there's nothing to sell. We talked about resistance, the specific mechanical argument you make to a bone when you ask it to adapt to a load it hasn't met before. We talked about cortisol and what sustained elevation does to the hormonal signals that govern whether the body is in a building phase or a bracing phase. Underneath all of it, the same finding kept surfacing. The condition of the bones is inseparable from the condition of the internal environment they live in. Not as a manner of speaking, as a documented physiological relationship. Chronic stress elevates cortisol. Elevated cortisol suppresses bone formation signals. The endocrine system doesn't separate your Tuesday from your skeleton. Neither should you. She reaches for her mug. The ceramic is warm now, steam rising, and she wraps both hands around it the way people do when they want something solid. Outside, the neighborhood is starting, a car, a door, the mechanical sigh of a garbage truck working its way down the block. The ordinary percussion of a morning that doesn't know it's supposed to be significant. She takes a sip, and for the first time since the word osteopenia entered her vocabulary and quietly rearranged everything behind it, she isn't braced, not reassured exactly, not finished with the worry, but no longer receiving her own body the way you receive a registered letter you already know contains bad news. She knows something now that she didn't know when she woke up. The scan measures density. It measures bone architecture. It measures what has already happened inside a structure over years, and it reports that in a number, and the number gets handed to you across a desk, and you're supposed to know what to do with it. What the scan cannot measure is direction. It cannot measure what the body is currently attempting. It cannot capture the difference between a person who has received the number and gone home to sit with it, and a person who has received the number and gone home to understand what environment produced it, and what adjustments to that environment are still available. That distinction doesn't appear on the printout. The woman standing on that cold floor at the start of this hour was not in danger only because her bones had thinned. She was in danger because she had no framework for the silence. She'd been trained the way most people are trained quietly over years to wait for pain as the legitimate signal. Everything before pain was assumption. Everything before pain was fine or fine enough, or at least not yet her problem. The scan interrupted that, said, it was always your problem. You just weren't receiving the frequency. Now she is. That's what sustained attention to this material does. Not change the bone overnight. Change the relationship to what's happening inside it. Change the quality of the questions asked at the next appointment. Change what gets tracked, what gets prioritized, what gets taken seriously before it becomes urgent. The woman sets down the mug, takes one more step. The tile is still cold, her feet still bare. The sound of her own weight moving across a Tuesday morning floor is small and unheroic and completely real. She listens to it. The silence of the bones was never an absence of signal. It was signal at a frequency the standard conversation doesn't hand you a receiver for. She has one now. So do you.